Canada in the post-war era, a time period also referred to as the Cold War from 1945 to 1991. A fairly long time period, and in fact, actually, the longest time period that we look at in this course. And as we go through this, you're going to see lots of examples or topics that we have previously either mentioned or explored before in this course, but now it is put into chronological order as the Cold War or the post war era was really the time when Canada became the middle power. So let's get started. The transition for the post war time for Canada went far smoother after the Second World War rather than the First World War. It was far better because in the First World War, the issues of profiteering, and just the fact that a plan needs to be in place to help those who put on the uniform to transition back into a peacetime society rather than a wartime, a total war society had to be done because the government did not want to repeat the same or events such as the Winnipeg General Strike or even the Dirty 30s with the Ontario Tract, the Regina riots, the mass unemployment, fears of socialism, and so on and so forth. And so the past experience had alerted the government that to the needs of returning soldiers and the changes that are required to allow them to transition back to a peacetime society, along with how society needs to be able to transition back to a peacetime society rather than a wartime society. One of the things to know and how that peacetime transition began is how or what were the major structural changes that began for the Canadian Armed Forces. At the end of the war, Canada had the fifth or sixth largest navy in the world. And the Canadian Armed Forces included the Army, the Navy, the Merchant Navy, and the Royal Air Force. In a peacetime society, the government of the day, Mackenzie, decided to disband the Merchant Navy and keep the other three branches. But though the Merchant Navy would be reorganized years later into the Coast Guard, which was led and is still as part of Department of Fisheries. Now, as we've covered before, if the long telegram still marks the beginning of the growing tensions between the Americans and the Soviets, the long telegram for the Cold War for that side, the event that marks the beginning for the Cold War for Canada was the Igor Gwozdzenko affair, as there was concerns of admission of a Russian cipher clerk of the existence of a Soviet spy ring inside of Canada. Igor Gwozdzenko's divulgence of this information made the realization that Canada was no longer removed from the international affairs, whether it's because of our involvement in the League of Nations, the victory of Vimy Ridge, our role in the Second World War, whatever the case might have been, we were no longer being ignored by other powers, and in fact, were being paid attention to by other powers. And the Igor Gwozdzenko affair made us realize that we were no longer removed from international affairs, especially since we were, for good or for ill, now associated now with the United States rather than Great Britain. And while there was certain challenges for that, it did present a new era for foreign affairs. And Igor Gouzenko was a cipher clerk who worked for the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. Yes, there has always been the Soviet embassy in Ottawa there, because Canada would begin to emerge as a middle power and try to take not a neutral stance, but try to find the middle ground between the two superpowers. But Guzenko defected on the 5th of September 1945 when 109 documents were sent over to the Soviets. Now, the Cold War will be when the USA and Russia would square off as world superpowers. And superpower means what you see coming up. But as a result of this, there was an escalation of nuclear weapons and the differing political views. The two nations would confront each other with the challenges for control of the developing nations around the world, especially those nations that were once colonies or territories of, say, Britain or France, but were now gaining their independence. On top of that, there was the founding of the United Nations, which the whole landscape of the international world order was fundamentally changed after the conclusion of the Second World War. And the superpowers would engage each other indirectly in small scale proxy wars that would constantly trying to gain more information, more spies and espionage on each other. So, what was the Cold War? The Cold War was a constant confrontation, though indirectly, but confrontation nonetheless, between the Soviet Union and the United States. But it was a Cold War because these two sides avoid direct armed conflict with each other, because that would have definitely led to World War III. So, what is a superpower? A superpower is when one country is so powerful through either military, economic, political, cultural, social, that it can just dominate over many other countries. There. At the end of the Second World War, there was only two superpowers, that being the United States and the Soviet Union. But the difference between a superpower and the colonial power was that colonial power still directly controlled and owned and administered colonies and territories and dominions, where a superpower did not. A superpower is far more powerful than a colonial power, such as the United States and the Soviets. On a map, you can see the changing world order at the conclusion of the Second World War. But as you can also tell from this political cartoon, well, Canada is in the middle between the two sides, being America to the south of Canada and the Soviet Union to the north of Canada. These two sides would directly engage each other, but not directly, and never were using the full capability of their weapon arsenals. And to keep you sharp, right, to always remember, the conflict of the Cold War was a conflict between democracy and communism. Just like how World War II was a conflict between democracy and fascism, the Cold War was now democracy, capitalism, and I'm sorry, democracy, capitalism versus communism. So, how did the Cold War begin? In the immediate years after VE Day, VJ Day, there were four key issues. One, why did the wartime alliance fall apart? Second, what were the fundamental ideological differences between the two superpowers? What happened at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference? And the roles of Truman and Stalin, those being Truman being the president of the United States and Stalin being the leader of the Soviet Socialist Republics. So Truman, some of the problems with Truman was, well, he helped oversee the establishment of the United Nations, which onto itself is actually a good thing, as they want to revisit the ideas of the League of Nations. While the idea was good, it has faults to it. But reason why it could be viewed as more of a problem was because while the League was located in Brussels, the UN new headquarters would be in New York City. From a communist point of view, is there any other city in the world in the late 40s that is more capitalist than New York City? I don't think so. Everything near there is a reason why New York was called the Big Apple. So, from a communist point of view, that would present some unfavorable challenges. The conferences also presented changes too, and differences between the two sides or the wartime alliance as well. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were getting along with each other, especially at the Yalta conference, what to do with the war. If you really pay close attention to the body language, you can see there is a difference between Yalta and then Potsdam. Also, in Potsdam, It's now Truman. If you look at Churchill's body language to the left-hand side, you can see while he's wearing a military uniform, his body language is very slouched. And I always view that as very symbolic of what now is happening with the British Empire or Commonwealth. On the right-hand side, you have Stalin. What, if you look closely, there's something really significant about Stalin in particular, and that is he's wearing the Navy uniform. In Soviet history, the Communist Revolution began in the Navy, the two sides. So one of the first problems in the Cold War, which actually would lead to the first crisis, would be what to do or how to split Germany. The Allied countries struggled to understand and come to agreement how to split Germany, especially with the process of how to denazify the population that had been brainwashed by the Nazis. And so it was decided that Germany would be split. East Germany would be kept under the Soviet sphere of influence and be turned to a communist country, whereas West Germany would be split into three different zones, being still one country, but West Germany would be a democracy, but within each zone there will be a French, an American, and a British zone. And within each of those three zones, the Allied powers would have different process of how to denazify the population. But there was a bit of a small problem there, that being Berlin. Berlin was in the Soviet side, the East Germany, and so Berlin would be the center point or a flashpoint of the first crisis. But before even that crisis, Churchill came up with the idea that the Western Europe or the whole of Europe was now split in half. And he described this as a iron curtain that had descended across the continent. That's the Iron Curtain on the map. Everything red or east of it was a communist country protected by what they call, or sound called Mother Russia, and the eastern side will be the democracies countries such as Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, East Germany, even Finland, Yugoslavia, and the various Balkan states will be involved with the Soviet Union. As Churchill has said, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace. In a way, Churchill felt while the battle against the fascists and the totalitarian governments had now been won, the actual war for the people of Europe was not over. But it's important to keep in mind that the Soviets lost over 20 million people in the war, and Stalin was determined to make sure that the Soviets' future would be kept secure, whereas Britain lost 370,000 people and the Americans just under 300,000. But before the Second World War began, there was a number of countries which could have claimed to be superpowers: Americans, Soviets, British, French, Imperial Japan, and Nazi Germany. And while all six of those were definitely colonial power, they were not superpower. Only the Americans and the Soviets were superpower, as they the only ones had the resources and the remaining military strength to go for it. Imperial Japan had been defeated. Nazi Germany had been thoroughly defeated and split in half. France, armed forces were left in ruins, and Britain no longer had the political will to maintain even the British Commonwealth and would go through a process of decolonization, which one of the bigger ones early on will be the establishment of India and Pakistan, and would end by 1990 with the final handover of Hong Kong over to the Chinese Communist Party. What both sides believed in is that the Americans were capitalists, the Soviets were communist. These were ideological differences that were completely opposite. And while they may have shared a common enemy, they hated fascism. Um, they had now defeated their common enemy and had no reason now to cooperate uh, on many items, other than maybe such as agreeing that the United Nations or trying the idea of the League of Nations once again to keep world peace should be attempted once again. And Europe, at the end of the Second World War, after the war, who would lead these countries? The Soviets favored communist groups. The Americans favored non-communist groups. Examples earlier on, what kind of government will be in the country will be um, uprisings in both Greece and Yugoslavia. And these are just one of many, many reasons of the growing tensions between the two superpowers. So, how did the United States respond to this? One of the Americans once said, "Well, Rome was what was to the ancient world. Great Britain had been to the modern world. America is to the world of tomorrow." Essentially, the Americans had a three-part plan. Well, two really: containment policy, which was the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan. The Americans will no longer be the isolationist, though wealthy and powerful country. That time of American policy was now over. From a Canadian point of view, the idea of containing communism, collective security, these all were points of view that Canada, the government, supported. One fundamental difference that began to emerge so between Canada and America, even though we were becoming closer with each other, was that we do not believe in the weaponization of nuclear technology. The nuclear technology itself is good, especially for power and like science, but not in the theater of war. And so Canada, while we are starting to emerge as a middle power, we were fine to continue to do our own our own thing. But there was, while that was happening, though, there was a intensification of tensions between the two sides. The Marshall Plan was an attempt to not repeat the mistakes of the First World War. And the Marshall Plan was an economic recovery for Europe, where America will be the main financer and banker and overseer of the financial and physical reconstruction of Western Europe because of the total war in the Second World War. Well, Europe was left in ruins. The Marshall Plan will be the financial plan to rebuild Europe, at least the Western side. It's over $10 million a year we spent on food and fertilizer, 13 billion grants and trade partnerships there. It is collective security for it. But the first actual crisis was the Berlin aircraft crisis. While they had no idea what to do with a defeated Germany, especially with how to denazify Germany, the Allies definitely wanted to stop the influence of communism. But Berlin was deep inside of East Germany, the communist country, and Berlin had also been split in half. Eastern side Berlin was communist, western side was democratic capitalist. Stalin didn't like that, so Stalin sealed off West Berlin in an attempt to starve the 2.5 million survivors in the city to capitulate. Truman would not allow this to happen there, so Truman ordered over 200,000 missions to fly from the West Germany over Berlin and drop supplies to support the people there. And Truman knew that as Stalin gave the order to shoot down the planes, this would be war between the two sides. Or, as another operation the British had planned for originally, it was called Operation Unthinkable. So eventually, the blockade was lifted. There was also, after the Berlin airlift crisis, there was some new wartime alliances there. This NATO would become known um, will manifest itself in the Korea War, Vietnam, Egypt, Cuba. And the NATO was a defensive posturing that would result for the democratic countries, whereas the Warsaw Pact was the alliance for the communist countries. The original idea of NATO was to stop the spread of communism, or as Americans were saying, the Red Menace there. But these are the member countries of NATO today, where NATO definitely is going through a bit of a transition now of what its actual role is, as NATO is definitely, without a doubt, the most powerful military alliance currently in existence, whereas the Warsaw Pact does not exist anymore. But while that is also happening, it should not be forgotten that in China, once Imperial Japan had been defeated, a second civil war began in China. A second civil war between Mao Zedong, the left, representing the communists, versus Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, or basically democrats, on the right side of the photo. And eventually, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, would lose the war in China, and Mao Zedong, the communists, would win the revolution or the civil war in China. So Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist followers would flee to Taiwan. After the dropping of atomic bombs, the Americans did not stop their testing and experimenting of atomic weapons, and they continued to test them on the Bikini Atoll or the Marshall Islands. The Soviets would test their first bomb a few years after the war. If Trinity was named the first bomb for the United States, First Lightning was the Soviets. After the Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb, the Americans developed and tested a hydrogen bomb, Mike. The hydrogen bomb was tremendously much more powerful than an atomic bomb. But once again, to review, well, was Canada making these kind of bombs? No. Canada denounced the weaponization of this kind of technology. Though Canada was not doing anything, there was quite a few mega national mega projects that were underway in Canada as a way to transition the society back into a peacetime society, but to keep the industry that supported the war healthy. And so projects such as the Trans Canada Highway would be built, the national highway across the country there. Years after, Eisenhower would implement the Intercontinental Highway System in America, which is not unsimilar to the Canadian Trans-Canada Highway, just that the American Interstate was far bigger. There's also the St. Lawrence Seaway. And no, they didn't build the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River existed naturally. But during the Second World War, the St. Lawrence River had been made off limits because of the Nazi U-boats torpedoing ships, even in Halifax Harbor. So the St. Lawrence Seaway construction was a mega project that was shared between the United States and Canada. And essentially, this made the St. Lawrence bigger, wider, and deeper. It made it, well, the St. Lawrence naturally was already a fairly large, substantial river. This made it into an actual seaway shipping route, which really benefited both countries because that area of North America, around the five Great Lakes, that is the massive industrial heartland for both countries. And to truly open up so you can have a lot more big ships and supplies. It was a transformative project that continues to have massive spell-offs on the financial, industrial, capitalist, entrepreneurial kind of level. And also there's other ones too, along with the Trans Mountain Pipeline, its first construction, the Camano Project, which um, there was actual Trans Canada Pipeline, the Avro Arrow fighter interceptor jet, the establishing of the Canadian Coast Guard, the founding of Trans Canada Airlines, which would now be Air Canada. So there was quite a bit of mega big projects that were happening in Canada in the immediate years after the war to transition the society from a wartime total war society back into a peacetime society. While Canada was gaining a lot more of an independent voice in the United Nations, and was now much more independent, while being aware of the espionage and what happened with the Igor Gouzenko affair and the long telegram there. But with the United Nations was a predecessor of the ineffective League of Nations. The UN was created in 1945 in San Francisco, and it was formulated on the idea of collective security. Actually, NATO too is actually made on collective security. That is Article 13 of the NATO Charter, which is attack against one is attack against all. While UN doesn't have that kind of a clause, the organization will be there to publicly condemn offending nations, impose economic boycotts, engage military forces, there to maintain and preserve world peace, while doing so better sake of promoting humanitarian work. This can be done through the Security Council, the most powerful part of the UN. And within the UN Security Council, there will be 5 permanent members, that being Britain, France, America, Russia, and China. We all will have a permanent presence on the Security Council, and they could have that veto power. There's the UN building in New York City. If you think about it, why do you think these 5 countries would get a permanent seat of veto power? It's to ensure that it would not be in their interest to leave the United Nations. That was one of the fundamental problems with the League of Nations, that some of the most powerful nations were not part of it. This time, they will be part of it. And also applying for peace, Canada would be an active member of the UN, participating in many aspects of the organizations and organs and groups associated with. And Canada will be a member of the Security Council from time to time again. And the Berlin airlift crisis was one of the first crises of the Cold War. Another major crisis, not counting the Korea War yet, was the Suez Canal crisis, where it was the Canadian Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson, who came up with the idea of international peacekeepers, a radical, transformative change to Canadian foreign policy, and also for UN peacekeepers. And the UN would be committed to the betterment of people's lives through many agencies such as the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the International Monetary Fund, and Canada will participate in many of these agencies as well as development projects, aid during natural disasters, helping out refugees. The UN allowed Canada to have a far greater importance and a far bigger voice than what would have normally been able to happen because of the small population. But there will be military apprehension that will lead Canada to have closer ties with the United States rather than Britain. Canada will commit to joining to NORAD in 1957, which was a defensive collective effort of North America, though heavily in the favor of the United States in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. And while there was a more towards independent kind of defense kind of strategies, the Americans would install warning systems throughout Canada to intercept intercontinental missiles. While Canada will definitely keep army brigades and air squadrons in Europe, and Canadian ships would track Soviet submarines. We worked closely with the Americans, but still had our own individual points of view and thoughts on the growing technology and the threat of ICBMs. So, what is an ICBM? ICBM is short for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. It is a nuclear missile that can be launched from anywhere on the planet and strike anywhere on the planet. Now, this was the, the buildup of the weaponry between both sides. And the IRBM are inter-range ballistic missiles. They are short-range nuclear missiles. Both, however, lead to mutually assured destruction. And the Canadian government will develop civil defense plans for citizens, and those more fearful will construct bomb shelters, fallout shelters. Canadians will become more conscious of communist ideologies and sympathies, whereas defense industries will screen their workers and unions to keep an watchful eye for anyone who is um, at all even sympathetic towards communism. There, the Cold War really was the deciding of whose side you are on. Do you support the Soviets, or do you support the American side? That was the ideological divide, the ideological difference between the two sides, and the actual idea of building Canadians, a lot of Americans did, but definitely Canadians too, would create their own fallout shelters to survive in case there was nuclear war between the two sides. One of the most infamous shelters that was even built by the Canadian government was called the Diefenbunker, a fascinating labyrinth there, which I highly recommend to go check out. And the movement towards a more independent kind of defense policy was a situation in Canada, as Canada did not want to parallel the American insanity and intensity, such as the McCarthy witch hunts in the Americans for searching for possible communists, whether it's in House committees or things are viewed as un-American. McCarthy witch hunts would ruin so many innocent people's lives because of the fear that they might have been too sympathetic towards communism. But the idea of the witch hunts just shows just how much tension, how much fear there was between the two sides. But if Suez Canal or Berlin airlift crisis were crisis in the Cold War early on, there was actual wars between the two sides, indirect, and the first one will be Korea, also known as the Forgotten War. Now, there's a lot that can be said about the Korean War, um, but that'll take way too much time. For right now, the Korean War, Korea was divided up in half. North was communist, South was democracy capitalist. The South was not ready to fight, and the North attacked, and the South nearly collapsed completely to the North. The UN, with Russia abstaining of the vote, authorized the use of military force, and John MacArthur and the Americans and such all come in. They came in and, well, basically liberated Southern Europe or Southern Korea, pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. And then China sent 300,000 plus soldiers over to bring everything back to the original line. Essentially, Korea was the last time Canada officially declared war upon another country. After Korea came the Suez Canal crisis, and our foreign policy changed to being peacekeepers. Though we can definitely argue now it's more peace enforcers rather than keepers. The Korea War did reach the climax of the fall of MacArthur, the famous general from the Pacific Theater. And when the war reached a stalemate, MacArthur wanted to open a new front on Chiang Kai-shek in the mainland China. He actually, MacArthur wanted to actually have the ability to use nuclear weapons on the Chinese army. Well, all these ideas Truman did not agree with. And so, MacArthur was a great wartime hero to the Americans in the Pacific War or theater. He was fired because the times were changed. Once again, there's a lot more that could be said about it, but we'll leave it like that. But while the Korea War was happening, other events in Canada would be the founding of the CFL, the Canadian Football League, a three was it three down? A three down um, touch football league was established, and the St. Lawrence Seaway construction was now completed. But while that was also happening, problem in Berlin began again because not from a crisis, but the Soviets built the infamous wall across Berlin, the Berlin Wall from 1961 to 1989, the physical actual divide between the two sides was constructed, dividing up the city of Berlin. One of the biggest and infamous events and situations of the Cold War would be the arms race between the Americans and the Soviets. And the arms race was a mass production of nuclear weapons on both sides, not always as to be used, but as a way to be a deterrence. And really, from the result of the arms race, the Americans will have over 450 ICBMs, 250 IRBMs, over 2,200 bombers, 16,000 tanks, 32 nuclear submarines, 260 conventional submarines, 76 battleships and carriers, and other warships, where the Soviets will have 76 ICBMs, 700 IRBMs, 1,600 bombers, 38,000 tanks, 12 nuclear submarines, 495 conventional submarines. It was a massive arms and armed forces buildup between the two superpowers. One extra technologies too the Americans developed was the U-2 spy plane, which was able to fly at significantly high altitude and take photographs of Soviet bases and missile sites. Along with the arms race came the space race. And early on, it was actually the Soviets that had the advantage in the space race. Sputnik was the first object sent into space. Yuri Gagarin was the first human into space. Earlier on, it was the Soviets that had all the advantage, had all the first milestones when it came to space. But the space would always be dominated by the Apollo missions. There's also the Mercury project and also the Gemini project. But ultimately, it was the Apollo mission, the Saturn V rockets, Apollo 11, Buzz Armstrong, Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, and so on. And Canada was a middle power during the height of the Cold War because of peacekeepers, because of our significant role in NATO and the United Nations, the fact that America is south of Canada, the Soviets were north, Canada was in the middle. But the issue about nuclear would still remain. Throughout the 1960s, there was tensions between the leaders of, basically the presidents of the United States and the Canadian Prime Ministers, because Canada denounced the nuclearization of nuclear technology. And both Diefenbaker and Pearson will have confrontation with Kennedy and Johnson over the use of nuclear weapons. And also, Canada became extremely hesitant to do anything in the Cuba Missile Crisis. Canada wanted to be a nuclear free country, period. But we did track Soviet submarines from bases in Halifax. Canada placed beacons on the ocean floor. Today, while these beacons can still be used for military reasons, a lot of these beacons are now used to track the migration of whales. And while Canada did not do the nuclearization of warheads, there was many distant early warning stations, such as this one at Hall Beach in Northwest Territory. These stations, along with the Mid-Canada radar line in the north and the middle country, were designed to be the primary line of defense over the pole, being the North Pole, to warn if there was any Soviet incursion or Soviet activity in the Canadian Arctic. Between the Dew Line stations and the Mid-Canada line, there will be 58 sites that will be built just like this, that will be used for over 30 years. There was also the forced relocation into permanent settlements for the Inuit, which definitely caused significant harm to the people, but also served as a way to provide the eyes and ears in the Arctic, as it is a really large area. Also, there was a location in the province of Saskatchewan called Uranium City, where weapons grade uranium was mined for the American effort. And the shipment of this weapons grade uranium we sent to the United States, but the route was kept secret. The site of actual Uranium City was very much radioactive there, but it was being used for 20 years. It also should be noted that during this whole time, this is the Quiet Revolution, the Quebecois, the Tranquil Revolution. All the issues, topics that were previously discussed about the situation in Quebec. This is the time period it was happening. Along with defense strategies, there was the Avro Arrow, which was a shining moment for the Canadian industry, as the Avro Arrow was a supersonic advanced interceptor jet. And while it was technologically advanced for its time, the Diefenbaker government decided to scrap the program to much significant controversy because it was felt that missiles were more effective than interceptor jets. This was also because of what had happened with the Soviets launching Sputnik and winning the first few significant milestones into space. And Diefenbaker was a conservative who defeated the liberal governments, and some thought the Avro Arrow was a project that was submarined or sabotaged in a way by the American government, because the Avro Arrow could fly at a much faster speed than any other American jets could. Ironic, because modern conflicts have utilized fighter jets exclusively, even into the 1990s. There was also the Vietnam War, where Canada did not officially participate. Kind of what happened with the Spanish Civil War. Canada did not officially participate in the Vietnam War because it was not a war that had been sanctioned by the United Nations. Though Canadian weapon companies did provide equipment to U.S. military, many Canadians were unimpressed by the killing and the fighting that was happening in Vietnam. But there were Canadians who still went over to fight, even as mercenaries. There was also the new Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, following after Lester B. Pearson, and Trudeau wanted America to be less influential, or more to the point, Canada to be less dependent on the United States. And he wanted to make Canada more different, even more sort of a middle power. And so he was one of the first countries to officially actually recognize the communist government of China, contrary to American opinion. He also dismantled the Bomark missiles that were used to instead of the Avro Arrow up in the Arctic there. He reduced Canada's military contingent in Europe by half. Pierre Trudeau was very much a charisma figure, which you remember he was the one who dealt with the FLQ crisis and martial law, but repatriated the Canadian Constitution with the amending formula and his main glory being the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But his foreign policy recognized there was a split between poorer countries and richer countries. And recognizing there is actually a split between the two sides, he initiated the Canadian International Development Agency, which was there to help to assist developing countries to get better. And we'll use the Thai aid where idea where Canadian aid would be provided if the country would agree to buy more Canadian-made goods there. On 21st of July 1969, the first moon landing occurred. The ozone layer was discovered in 1979. Canadian Space Agency was established with while there has been Canadian astronauts, there tends to be a lot of robotics with the Canadian Space Agency, but there is that famous Canada arm for robotics. But overall, there's just a lot of development of Canada as a middle power. Canada would join the La Francophonie, an organization of French-speaking countries and many former colonies of France. It participated in the Colombo Plan to assist developing countries along with the CEDA. Canada invested in overseas students to study in Canada and then bring their assistance back home. As a middle power, we supported the Strategic Arm Limitation Treaties, which reduced the number of nuclear weapons between the Americans and the Soviets. There, the Second SALT Treaty, but there was still ongoing tensions between the two sides, such as what happened with when the Korean passenger jet, the pilots failed to make the correct heading and wandered too far into an off-limit zone of the Soviet Union and was shot down. But Trudeau wanted Canada to have distant ties with Americans. Mulroney wanted Canada to have closer ties with the United States. And this was seen with Mulroney even supporting even greater role of NORAD. Mulroney supported the idea of weaponizing space there. Mulroney was very much controversial um, in it. And Mulroney also tried to solve the Quebec issue by getting Quebec to sign the Constitution. First was at Meech Lake, and the second was at the Charlottetown Accord. Both did fail, though. Mulroney did bring much closer ties for Canada with the United States, like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Today, it's been because of the Trump administration, it is now CUSMA, Canadian United American Mexico Trade Agreement there. And while I hope that Canada will attract more businesses from south of the border and larger access to American market, Canadian businesses fear the potential competition from bigger, more multinational American businesses, and some fear that Canadian businesses will move farther south to even to Mexico, where it was cheaper and the protocols were far less stringent there. But the Cold War would come to an end with a change of leadership in the Soviets. Gorbachev policy of Glasnost and Perestroika brought sweeping economic, social, political changes to the Soviet. Censorship was lessened, and people like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Romania all demanded changes. The army began to stand against the government. Gorbachev would be the last of the Soviet Union leaders. And so the end of the Cold War happened in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. But there was the Tiananmen Square massacre that happened in China. But the fall of the Berlin Wall definitely is a symbolic tearing down the differences between the two sides. And while recent decades have seen Canada be active, Persian War, Yugoslavia, and Africa, Canadian forces participated in Gulf activities, bombings Yugoslavia. There, uh, the New World Order, the United States would take more of an active role of police force rather than police keeping. And New World Order, Canadian troops participated in Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, um, continues to work with the United Nations there. But there are quite a few issues that happen in Africa, which will be explored on a different day there. One of the biggest issues would be what happens is the refugees, as there are many refugee problems currently. The New World Order would see Canada's participation in these conflicts give rise to questions about Canada's involvement and commitment to international affairs. Some have suggested that Canada should not have been involved in Yugoslavia. Others have said we have a duty to help. Also, that we must do more with NATO and either be even more lockstep and sync with the United States or be less. But with the globalization, Canada has still relies heavily on the United States, but because of globalization, such as the free trade agreement with the European Union, Trans-Pacific Partnership, the remaking of NATO or NAFTA into CUSMA, the market is evolving. Canada also joined APEC, fully embrace globalization there, and proposal globalization will say that a rise of living standards will invest, where others say it is not. And so, really, to Canada's credit, it has always insisted upon commitment to human being rights and packages with countries that has to make a fair deal and adhere to the ideas of human rights. And that's what we're going to cover for today.